let's recap meditation 5, then we're going to wrap up our discussion of the meditations with meditation 6. Next week we'll move into some correspondence. I've uploaded them to Canvas. The relevant correspondences are: 1, you're going to have Elizabeth and Descartes. This one's quite brief. The second one is quite long. Get through as much of it as you can. It is Gassendi and Descartes. I wanted to choose Hobbes and Descartes, but it really devolves into a shouting match between the two. It's fun to read from that perspective, but it's not overly fruitful. From a fruitful perspective, it's better to read Gassendi and Elizabeth. They disagree with Descartes. I think they win over Descartes, but at least they're civil about it. So let's recap meditation 5. We get an ontological argument for the necessary existence of God. Remember, we said that the ontological argument originally comes from St. Anselm, and St. Anselm's version is refuted by a contemporary named Galileo. And Descartes kind of picks up this mantle and tries to save the ontological argument. So Descartes and Anselm's are very similar. The really only place that they vary is in how they justify premise 1. So very brief recap here. We start off with a definition of God, where God is the greatest possible, sometimes you'll see this rendered as greatest conceivable. I'm sure there is a fine line distinction we can draw there. I'm not going to bother. The greatest possible or greatest conceivable being. Remember, we have this latent premise that existence is a perfection. We have the claim, I have an idea of God. I'm going to move over here for convenience. If God exists in the mind, then God must exist in the world. Should probably renumber this a little bit. Put 4 here as it is better or more perfect. So it's better to exist both mentally and in the world than just mentally. If God exists in the world, if God exists in the mind, then God must exist in the world. And we get this per 1 and 2. Therefore, we get a conclusion. God exists in the world. If you don't like this argument, don't worry. It has not been overly popular in the history of Western philosophy. It's kind of a bad argument. And Galileo just destroys poor St. Anselm on it. it doesn't work. And it may not even work for Descartes. There's maybe still some issues with it. I think this is a really problematic premise. People like Hume are going to object to premise 3. But the difference between the way Descartes and Anselm tried to articulate premise 1, they both agree that on this definition of God is the greatest possible or greatest conceivable being. But the distinction is Anselm, his definition is just a claim. It's not grounded in anything. Okay? He's just providing a definition of God, which is then open to refutation. Whereas Descartes, he provides the same definition of God, however, he grounds it in clear and distinct perceptions. Now, this may seem like a trivial distinction. It may seem like all Descartes is doing is saying, oh, I have a clear and distinct perception of God, therefore I'm good. And I think that's a really sarcastic way to read this argument, because the meditator at this point, based on what we did on meditation 4, genuinely take it to believe that clear and distinct perceptions are the building blocks of sound epistemic beliefs. So the thought here is that, look, if we can have a clear and distinct perception of P is some proposition, then we can rely on that. It's not simply the meditator saying, I have a clear and distinct perception of God, therefore it's stronger than Anselm's definition. No, this is genuinely supposed to be a firm epistemic standing point. So I propose that we kind of give the meditator and Descartes a little bit of grace here on proposition 1, simply because if we are following the meditations, at least this grounding of the definition of God and the epistemic work that it's intended to do is grounded in the meditations. Now, we can still think, and we should still think, that existence as a perfection is an utterly insane idea. Because remember, we said that a perfection so we say that X is a perfection if X is a quality that comes in degrees. That's what it is to be a perfection. It's for X as a perfection if, we're going to say if and only if X is a quality that comes in degrees. So remember, we gave some examples here. So e.g. strength, because we could say that John is stronger than Jim. Beauty, we could say that John is more beautiful than Jim. Intelligence, let's give Jim a bone here. Jim is smarter or more intelligent than John. We can say wealth. Wealth is a perfection because wealth comes in degrees. But conceiving of existence in this way it's very unnatural. Okay? Now we can see why the meditator is doing this and why Anselm does this here in proposition 4. It is better to exist both mentally and in the world, just mentally. So we see here, based on proposition 4, that the meditator is conceiving of, at bare minimum, 3 different ways in which X can exist. So X can exist in the world. X can exist in the mind. X can exist in the world and the mind. And I take it the meditator is really conceiving of existence in the mind and existence in the world as separate ways in which something can exist. This little backward E here, this is how we represent existence in contemporary philosophical logic. ironic because now in logic we no longer conceive of existence as a perfection. It's not a quality. Rather, it is a modifier. It modifies the entire proposition. It does not simply modify the substance of the thing that it's being attached to. So this is meditation 5 in a nutshell. At the end of meditation 5, what do we get? We still have our res cogitans that we know some things about, and we got God, and we got clear and distinct perceptions. So moving into meditation 6, we're going to use mainly God and clear and distinct perceptions in order to rebuild the meditator's knowledge. If you recall the title of the meditations, all the way back on like page 1, the full-length title is Meditations on First Philosophy Concerning God, that He necessarily exists, and that the mind and the body are distinct. So we already got the God part. Did that in meditation 3 and meditation 5. Pretty cool. But we still haven't gotten this mind-body distinction yet. This is where meditation 6 comes in. This is kind of like final fanfare of the meditations. It's this final bit where the meditator in meditation 6 is going to argue for substance dualism. And she's going to argue for an external world. Okay? So very briefly, let's do some background here. The position that is dualism is contrasted typically to the position of physicalism. Traditionally, there are other ways to distinguish this. Dualism, it comes in a lot of different varieties. So you can have substance dualism, which is what Descartes is going to argue for, and perhaps the other most common version is property. Let's probably say this is materialism. Materialism is the view that there's only matter in the world. What dualism generally tries to argue, this is a very broad blanket claim, is there is a distinction between the mental and the physical. Seems fairly innocuous, but this claim here that there's a distinction between the mental and the physical doesn't really jive well with modern physics. Modern physics is incredibly materialistic, not in a vain way, but in a philosophic way, because modern physics says something like this. This is the position of materialism. Only matter exists. So it's just that simple. Everything is material. Everything from cats to dogs to peoples to trees to the wind is material to thoughts are material. Think about some work in contemporary neuroscience where so think of technology like an EEG or EEG, where they track brain waves, okay? What are they tracking with a brainwave? They're tracking the electrical patterns that the brain emits, right? And then we can classify those patterns into different types of waves. And from that we can understand how certain information and certain reasoning is done in different parts of the brain. Technology like this only works if materialism is true. Technology like this only works if there is some material thing, in this case electrical impulses, for the technology to pick up on. So dualism is by far the bolder position. Descartes is going to argue for an even bolder kind of dualism. He's going to argue for what is called substance dualism. This is like if you play blackjack, you know you can either hit or you can double down. This is the doubling down. This is the strongest version of dualism you're going to get. What substance dualism maintains is that mental stuff, I'm going to use this very vaguely, and physical stuff are different substances. So it's not simply that the mind and the body are one unit. This is kind of an Aristotelian position, this hylomorphic view of things, and that there's just mental properties and physical properties, but it's really just one thing. Substance dualism is arguing that no, the mind is independent from, can exist independently from the body, and the body can exist independently from the mind. This is the position, very generally, of your Abrahamic faiths. Okay? It's a rather bold position. But this is what Descartes is going to argue for, or the meditator is going to argue for. In order to get there, though, we first have to get a couple of concepts under our belt before we can look at the argument proper. The first thing we need to look at is the difference in varieties of distinctness. Because there's three different ways in which the meditator and Descartes use this claim. Things can be either modally distinct, they can be conceptually distinct, or they can be a real distinction, so they can be real distinct. It's bad grammar, but I'm going to run with it. In a different work of Descartes, The Principles, he lumps these two together. So I'm not going to harp on them too much, the fine line nuances. But what modal and conceptual distinctness is a distinction that is drawn in the mind. So think back to Cartesian metaphysics. At our most fundamental, we have substance. All substances have a primary attribute. And then primary attributes have modes. Okay? So remember, the primary attribute is the same thing as the essence. It is what it is to be a thing of a certain kind. And modes are ways that the primary attribute is manifested. So the example at hand is mind is a substance. The primary attribute of mind is thought or thinking, and a way in which I can think is desiring. But I can also be affirming. This is what these modal and conceptual distinction is. I can differentiate in my mind between two different mental states, one of affirmation and one of desire, but there's no distinction out there in the world. The term we like to use is, it's not cutting nature at the joints. Okay? These are purely mental distinctions. There is no sense in which desire and affirmation can be divorced from thought, which can be divorced from mind. There's no such thing as thought running out in the world. There's no such thing as desire or affirmation in the world. There's minds that, because they think, can do these different kinds of thoughts. Take a physical example. Let's take an example of a shirt. Okay? A shirt is a material thing, so its primary attribute has to be extension. But then there's ways in which extension can be manifolded. There's color. Okay? But in order to have color, I have to have extension, which implies I have some physical thing. In our example, a shirt. Think about this proposition. There is blue. What's that mean? There's blue. The proposition is incoherent, right? Because there's no blue out in the world. There's blue, I don't know, there's blue fruit, there's blue markers, there's blue hair, blue shirts, blue cars, but there's no blue out in the world. Okay, so this is what this level of distinction is about. By contrast, real distinction is picking out different things that exist in the world. So the most fundamental real distinction is between mind and matter, where the primary attribute, once again, is thought and extension, respectively. Or if you are reading the meditations, what the meditator calls continuous quantity. It's an antiquated phrase for extension, but they mean the same exact thing. Okay, so real distinctness picks at things that actually exist in the world. Okay. Let's see what's. Let's look at this argument here where Descartes, or the meditator, argues for substance dualism. This is perhaps the crux of Meditation 6. And it's the part that in the correspondences receives the most flack. Perhaps the one who best articulates the objection to Meditation 6 is Thomas Hobbes. Even though it devolves into a shouting match as the correspondence goes on, Hobbes has perhaps the best objection to substance dualism. So this real distinction argument, I'll read it to you. This is in Meditation 6. I know that everything which I clearly and distinctly understand is capable of being created by God, so as to correspond exactly with my understanding of it. Hence, the fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that two things are distinct, since they are capable of being separated at least by God. The question of what kind of power is required to bring out such a separation does not affect the judgment that the two things are distinct. Thus, simply by knowing that I exist and seeing at the same time, that absolutely nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I am a thinking thing. I can infer correctly that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing. It is true that I may have, or to anticipate that I certainly have, a body that is very closely joined to me. But nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, insofar as I am simply a thinking thing, non-extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of a body, insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body, and I can exist without it. So, we have two things here. We have the res cogitans, aka what he calls here the thinking thing, and just to keep with the Latin, the res existens, the existing thing. Or we may simply think of this as the res corpus, the bodily thing. Okay? And what the meditator is saying, remember this is all built on this thought that clear and distinct perceptions are the valid forms of building our knowledge, is that, look, I can imagine myself clearly and distinctly as just a mind, just a thing that thinks. But at the same time, I also conceive of myself as having a body. And that seems like a really clear and distinct perception. Now, the meditator is not saying that bodies and minds are separable in the real world or separable by any natural means. Rather, the meditator is saying that this is a real distinction. Go back to our earlier terminology. It is a real distinction between mind and body. However, it's a distinction that, in order for the two to come apart, could only ever be made by God. So it's not the case that we have to worry about our minds getting separated from our bodies in any way. So, like, you have movies like Freaky Friday, for example. They're built on this thought of substance dualism. The meditator is not worried about Freaky Friday style situations. Even though mind and body are real distinctions, not modal and not conceptual distinctions, they are real distinctions, they're not going to come apart naturally. They can only come apart by God. So this is not quite an accurate pictorial representation, but think of it this way. Okay? We got bodies out in the world. And there's then a mind. These minds are, at least from our perspective, permanently linked to these bodies. Okay? Nevertheless, the mind and the body, as the pictogram represents, are two separate things. The reason I say this is not completely accurate is because I have to represent the mind as existing somewhere in space. In this case, I have it hovering above the body. But remember, the mind does not have extension. The mind does not exist in space. So, if I was to do this accurately somehow, once again, you can't really draw it, but there is mind that does not physically exist, that is somehow inextricably linked to one particular body. Okay? So, for the sake of the pictogram, this is what we're envisioning here. But don't be too committed to this pictographic representation because mind has no extension. Mind takes up no physical space and does not exist in space. Okay? Think of this kind of like Judeo-Christian conceptions of God. God exists, God does not exist in space. Okay? This is how Descartes conceives of the mind. So, we get three claims here. Let me just erase my stick here, guys. We have complete being as far as the thinking thing goes, where the thought is a thinking thing exists as a substance whose primary attribute is thought. We then have the complete being of the bodily thing, which is body. Can exist as a substance whose primary attribute is extension. But then we also have this, what falls out of 1 and 2 because of this argument. We have mutual exclusion. Which is to say, the thinking thing has no bodily modes, and the body has no mental modes. This kind of view stands, at least in the history of philosophy, stands in stark contrast to what was probably one of the more dominant views up until the rise and prominence of the Roman Catholic Church. And this view is originally proposed by Aristotle. And it gets called hylomorphism. It comes from 2 Greek words. It comes from the Greek word hule, which means matter, and morphe, which means form or shape. And the view that Aristotle proposes with hylomorphism is that there is one thing in the world, not 2 things. There's not mind, there's not body. There's one thing. There is what we come to call a hylomorphic compound. Now, we can conceive of separating the form from the matter, right? So take a statue, a bronze statue. Take a better one. Take the Statue of Liberty, okay? I can conceive of the Statue of Liberty being made of gold. I can conceive of it being made of plastic. I can conceive of it being made of any kind of matter. I can conceive of it being made of fresh bronze, okay? In the same way, I can imagine that the bronze that is the Statue of Liberty being reshaped into a guy, or being reshaped into a statue of a cat, okay? I can change the matter and the form in my mind, but in reality, these two never come apart. So whereas Aristotle is maintaining that the distinction between form and matter is merely a modal or a conceptual distinction, Descartes doubles down. Descartes is saying, no, this is not a conceptual or a modal distinction. The mind and the body, this is a real distinction. They are 2 different substances that do not partake of one another at all. Now, Elizabeth is going to kind of have a hold my beer moment here and say, whoa, Descartes. If they don't partake of one another at all, how is it that my thoughts can affect my body? That seems really problematic because I think in my mind, itch my nose, and then my body does the thing. But if the mind is non-extended and distinct from the body, and the body is extended with no mental modes, how does this mind-body interaction work? That seems really problematic. And as we'll get to next week, Descartes' going to hem and haw and kind of flounder this one. But we see what Descartes doing here is turning what Aristotle conceived of, not in that language, but conceived of as a conceptual or modal distinction, and saying, nope, it's a real distinction. As you can imagine, this is heavily influenced by the view of Christianity. Remember Descartes' writing in 17th century France, other than Italy. I don't think there is a more Roman Catholic European nation state at the time than France. So you can see the influences. Okay, so where we have now is where we're now at in meditation 6, what we got out of the world is we got mind, we got God, and we got body. And these two are linked. Doing pretty good. Right? Now we don't have anything else in the external world. There's no trees, no cats, no dogs, no tables, no houses, no grass. But there's minds linked to bodies at least. All right? So, we're starting to populate this world. And all of this, all three of these are built upon the bedrock that is clear and distinct perception. Remember the cogito. That's a clear and distinct perception. The argument in meditation 3 for God is supposed to render us with a clear and distinct perception, as the argument does in meditation 5, which is built upon a clear and distinct perception. The argument for body in meditation 6 is also grounded in a clear and distinct perception. The last thing I'm going to do, and we'll discuss this more next time, we'll do a little bit of discussion on it, is where are we going to get the external world? Because Descartes is going to argue that the external world exists. So we're going to add to this external world. It's a nice thing to have. This comes in meditation 6. I'm going to write down the argument, and we'll discuss it more next time. So just feel free to copy if you wish, but this will be discussed more next time. So claim 1, Proposition 1 is we have sensory ideas which purport to be of external things. Remember this time period, idea means a mental image. So you cannot have a mental idea of that which you have not perceived. The function of our sensory faculty is to reveal the world around us. So the function of our senses is to reveal environmental information. At this time period, I'll talk about this more next time, your sensory faculties, so your 5 senses, are perceived of as being passive. They're the kind of things you don't turn on. So as long as you have functioning eyes, you can't help but see. If you have functioning ears, you can't help but hear. If you have skin, you can't help but touch. Okay? They're not the kind of things that you have to choose. I'm going to choose to see the whiteboard. I'm going to choose to make my eyes work. No, they're just constantly receiving information. Now that we will draw a distinction later between stimuli coming in and focusing on the stimuli, there is a distinction there. So like hearing versus listening, if we think in English, I can hear the music, doesn't mean I'm listening to the music, right? Same way you can hear your professor, not listen to your professor, right? Same idea. But the hearing, sensory information is passive. As long as your ears work, you can't turn it off. This is why people who struggle to sleep at night put on sleeping masks and plug their ears, because they can't turn off these sensory faculties. So, Proposition 3, sensory faculties are passive. So sensory ideas must be external. Remember, ideas are mental pictures. Okay, I'm moving over here, so I didn't plan it as well. We have a conclusion here with 4. Sensory ideas come from either bodies, God, sensory bodies, or God. Refer back to, so this follows from 1 and 3, plus the causal principle in meditation theory. Remember the causal existence of God. We have this distinction between objective and formal reality. Meditators relying on this again. If sensory idea of bodies did not come from bodies, then God would be a deceiver. But go all the way back to meditation 1. God is not a deceiver. Did this one in meditation 1. Therefore, body that is external to us, external bodies, must exist. We're going to look at this argument in more detail next time. But this is the deductive rendering of the argument for the existence of the external world. A lot of this argument is predicated on the way in which the senses are understood, and this thought here of 5 and 6, that God would be a deceiver, that God is not a deceiver. But remember, it's a meditation. It's supposed to be progressive. You didn't get to meditation 6 without reading meditations 1 through 5. The way the meditations are done is you start meditation 1, read it, digest it, move on. Read, digest, move on. And everything is supposed to build upon one another. So by the time you got to meditation 6, you've already bought in to proposition 6 that God is not a deceiver. You bought into that in meditation 1. The same way you bought into that sensory ideas can only come from bodies or from God, because you bought into the causal principle in meditation 3. Okay? This is just the structure of how meditations as a genre are supposed to work. All right, we'll pause there, and we'll pick up next time with more discussion of the external world argument in meditation 6, as well as looking at the correspondence between Descartes and Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia.